Welcome to Strictly Facts, a guide to Caribbean history and culture, hosted by me, Alexandria Miller. Strictly Facts teaches the history, politics, and activism of the Caribbean and connects these themes to contemporary music and popular culture. Hello, everybody. Watagwan, Pamwatagwan. Thank you so much for tuning in to another episode of Strictly Facts, a guide to Caribbean history and culture. We talk about history and stories so much on this show, but what about the process of documenting our stories? There are many ways to do that, of course, passing them down through our families verbally, writing them down, but what about the films that really make our moments, right? And bring Caribbean stories to life? In the last year alone, I can think of several incredible powerhouse films and shows that document Caribbean experiences at home and in the diaspora. Special shout out to my podcast aunties Carrie Ann Reed Brown and Michaela Malcolm, doing all of the unpacking of some of these shows over on their podcast, Reels and Rhythms. But nonetheless, what is the process like for creating films on Caribbean stories? And how do we ensure that, we're bringing some of the things like our folklore and these things to life in the modern day? Here with us to unpack these questions today is Alyscia Cunningham, a multifaceted award-winning author, filmmaker, of course, tactile artist and photographer, and the founder and executive director of Her House Media, through which she creates narratives of resilience and triumph over adversity. Alyscia, thank you so much for joining us today. Why don't you tell our listeners a little bit more about yourself, your connection to the Caribbean, and what motivated your interest in Caribbean storytelling, particularly through filmmaking?
Yes, well, thank you for having me, Alexandria. It's nice to be here. Again, my name is Alyscia Cunningham, and I am an independent filmmaker as well as an independent author and impact artist. What does that mean? It means that I create works of art that has an impact within the community. You walk away with something that you've learned or something that you want to make a change on into your life. And background is I'm a first generation American. I still say that I'm Trini despite that. My parents are from Trinidad, from down south. So anybody who knows is San Fernando and Town, where it's still pretty country, and I appreciate it. And a lot of the folklore stories that were shared to me from my parents, I think also stemmed from those areas as well, down south. And so my focus in the work that I create is documentary and narrative horror. It doesn't mean that I'm not interested in other subjects or genres, but those are my two favorite subjects. Say the stories that I was told as a kid inspired the work that I create now as an artist.
You bring me, of course, to our first question in that just, mentioning the impact of your parents telling you stories of Caribbean folklore and its impact on you. And so for you as a filmmaker, what is the sort of power of Caribbean storytelling? How would you define that? And how have you seen it evolve through your own work and, of course, through other works of film that have come out of the region or, of course, the diaspora as well?
So storytelling is everything, whether it is the genre or it's a play or an exhibition, there's a story in everything. And it inspired me because, I mean, the stories of my elders, my parents specifically, but then also my grandparents, great grandparents. I had an auntie that inspired the film that I did, Dwent, which is my recent production. But the stories that were shared with me really stuck with me. And I was one of those children that really enjoyed sitting down with my elders and just having conversations. I enjoy talking to people now. I'm not surprised that I am actually in the field of filmmaking because I enjoy having conversations. And I feel personally that storytelling isn't everything. And the power in that is based on what you do with it, really.
You brought up your own work, talking about doing two, but before we, really dive into that short film that you have more specifically, I know, and you also mentioned that horror is a major genre for you in terms of some of that work. And, when I think of Caribbean stories that were told to me by my grandparents, by my parents, etc. They definitely have that spooky, haunting, horrid element. There are places in Clarendon that my mom talks about, walking, she needs to go from one auntie's house to a next auntie's house and has to pass a graveyard. And because
Right.
somebody told her a story about such man in the graveyard, she used to run past to try to get to where she needs to go, right?
Right.
Um, and so all that to say, those sort of haunting stories are such an integral part of who we are, but I can't think of, as many films that are sort of replicative of that, hauntingness, or the duppy stories or whatever, right? And so, in your own estimation, either maybe why aren't there as many Caribbean horror films, or why has it really been important for you to bring that sort of element of folklore, specifically from the element of our scary stories to life?
Yeah, so well, first is why there aren't as many horror films relative to Caribbean stories. I think the one of the biggest things is exposure. So on the other side, I'm also a panel judge, right? So I sit on panels or with organizations where I can read different grants. And although I can't share what I've read or the people who've submitted or organizations, I've noticed that actually not one grant that I've seen so far from the panels I've sit on have been from Caribbean-based filmmakers. So then the question for me, I know the playing field is not level when it comes to funding, which is always the biggest hurdle, I would say, as a filmmaker, as an artist in general, when you want to create a project. But it's also, what are we being exposed to? Like, why aren't there any Caribbean filmmakers that are securing or looking for funding? Um, and then that then comes down to the same thing as why there aren't films or Caribbean horror films that have been released. Because I've known locally independent, filmmakers who have done some films, but nothing to the scale of like a feature film. And um, I just think that there's an unawareness of opportunities there. So there is funding. It's hard, and I'm not gonna, sit and try to sugarcoat it. It's very hard to raise funds, but I just think that there has not been the exposure. So within our community, unfortunately, to say, hey, you know what? I know the situation. I know where this funding is, or I can help you to create this. And I'm not saying that to in any way to knock us down, but we definitely need to be able to like support one another to get to a higher level of doing things is definitely needed. So it's important to me to bring the Caribbean folklore into filmmaking because it is my culture. This, number one, I grew up with these stories. And then two, I want to honor my ancestors and to be able to showcase the stories that were told that are honestly fading at the moment because we're in a situation now where you don't have as many of the younger generation that are spending time with their elders as they did when I was growing up. And it's unfortunate truth. It's a beautiful thing when I'm now sharing this. So for example, Dwayne, I had a recent premiere, a screening, and to hear the older people in the audience say, "Oh my gosh, this brought memories back to me." Like I learned something that I didn't learn before, and then the younger generation say, "I've never even known about this." So for me, it's a bridge, with the gap between the young and the old, and that bridge, which is the film or the work that I create as a filmmaker, is the bridge with this specifically with this horror that I just recently did with Dwayne and then leading into a feature film. But it is the bridge with the young and the old to be able to have conversations and to share these stories again, to just open up the conversation for the stories to be told.
So you mentioned Duen 2, of course, your recent piece. There was also a precursor. So there's a first Duen or Duen 1, and then Duen 2, right? And so for our listeners who are not familiar, Duen is one of the figures in Trinidadian folklore. And I think one of the ones that's interesting to me because of the focus on children, when we think of various parts of folklore culture, right? They're usually more general, like not specifically targeting any like particular person or gender or whatever, but duens definitely are connected to sort of pranking children specifically. There's this whole sort of description of the duen as, being faceless. Their feet are kind of turned backwards in a sense, right? And they're always sort of trying to lure children back out into the forest with them. And so that's a little bit about the Duen for anybody who's, unfamiliar and sort of interested. You know, I really want to ask you, why did you choose the Duen of all of the characters, and, all of the varieties of our folklore? What was it about the Duen for you that you thought, you really wanted to base your film specifically on that character? And why do you think it's sort of distinct in terms of our folklore apart from, some of the other characters?
So I always tell people that Dwayne was one of those stories as a kid that scared me really good. It was, and I think also relative to me being a child. Like I've heard about Sukunya and Laja Bless and all the other characters, but it was that I think relative to me being young and thinking about children being young and that they have no face and only a mouth to call children into the forest was really scary, you know. And then also the connection to saying that these children. So the with the Dwayne, it said that they're mischievous childlike spirits who died before they were baptized, and they were known to prank children specifically, but also raid gardens and terrorize the neighborhood. But the fact that they would scare kids, there was nights when I know I could not sleep when I first would hear it, or my parents would share the story, or when I went to Trinidad and my cousins are sharing the story in Saparia, which is really country. um, it scared me really good because it was relative to my age.
Why don't you tell us a little bit? I know you don't might not want to give away the full storylines, right? But for our listeners turning in who definitely might be interested, and are looking forward to, the short film and, hopefully feature film later. Do you want to share a bit about the Duen and Duen 2 storylines? And in addition to that, sort of what stylistic choices do you feel like you made in order to give it that Caribbean horror feel?
Yes, yes. So Dwayne One actually was still based on. So of course I put my own twist to it, but it was based on the two young ladies, and people can see it on YouTube. I have it posted on there. Sisters who happen to survive. They're in a world right now where they are doing outside, you know. So they're very careful to not speak too loud because, again, the saying with the Dwayne goes is that you don't respond if they call your name. That was one of the things as a kid. Also, is like if you hear anybody call your name in the woods, I think it also may be relative to maybe the folklore was created based on children being safe too, you know? So don't respond if somebody calls your name. And so the Dwayne one was based on that. It was a grandmother telling her grandchildren the story. But the person who plays the grandmother in that story, it really encouraged me to expand on it, to make it into a feature film. So that's Diane Marshall. She plays the Auntie Sybil in the Duen 2. And Duen 2 it's a proof of concept. So it's a short based on the story world of the feature film. So we start off in the kitchen where she is making sweetbread with her niece, her great niece, and then things kind of take a turn for the worse. The folklore really evolves into the physical world. And I won't go much more there so that people can see the film once it, reaches the local film festival circuit. But that is the inciting incident. The folklore opens up some trauma because it's relative to family trauma, and I'll leave it there. But you find out at the end. So that's where I am right now is I'm in fundraising phase, raising money. It'll be my first feature film.
I mean, I'm certainly interested, so I'll definitely be sure to add our link for, Duen One, for our listeners to check out. But definitely also really looking forward to, you hopefully producing Duen Two into a full feature film, right? I think again, something that's super needed, and maybe sort of wanted to push you a little bit more to think about the feature film side of things in terms of horror. I know I sort of, in a way, asked this question earlier. Do you feel like there's something about horror for us that has translated? It obviously translates well in terms of, you know, us, having had grandparents tell these stories, etc. I feel like I can think of a million films on music from the Caribbean, right? And nothing as much significantly on our horror stories. And so I don't know, I find that discrepancy really interesting and don't know if you have any thoughts specifically to that.
Yeah, so that's kind of similar to what I was mentioning earlier and why, the sitting on the panel. I'm not seeing any stories, period, from Caribbean filmmakers, but especially the horror genre. There's also a bit of an ignorance, I would say, from my own personal experience. When I talk about that I'm into horror and I'm speaking to the Caribbean community, and I get two responses. It's either people like, oh, that's cool. I like that you're doing the folklore. Oh, I know, that folklore. I remember these stories as a kid, that, and people get into the conversation. I love having that conversation. It's either that or I get the people who are like, you do horror. So then it's like, um, it's kind of like taboo, I would feel. Some people really love it and they love the memories, or some people tend to stay away from it because it feels to them as if it's I'm not sure how to word that. They're a little skeptical when it comes to that side of horror. So I think that might also be a reason why we may not have as many of Caribbean people into that horror genre. I know money is an issue, that's always an issue, but actually getting into it, I feel like people might tend to step away from it because of the fear of maybe bringing something else into the space of horror, or maybe people assuming that you're working on horror, so you might be into something that that might not be so nice. So I think that that is a level of ignorance, to be honest with you, and on why you might not see as many horror stories, aside from, of course, funding.
Yeah, I definitely would agree with that. I think, our horror stories can tend to lead into a place of, talking about maybe things like phobia,
Right.
and other sort of practices and things that, of course, from a Hmm, what word do I want to use, right? From
Right.
a particular standpoint, some folk might disagree with or not want to uplift. To like again, a sort of earlier point that you made, right? There is a little bit of that distinction between generations and something that I hope, we sort of preserve, right? We don't want to sort of lose the stories that made us who we are because while, it's in a sense difficult to figure out and pinpoint the like origins of some of these particular folkloric stories, right? There, of course, are deeper messages, right? Like, I'm sure, if we got into the analysis of the Duene a little bit more, right? I'm sure there's a piece of it that's also parents wanting to, caution their children to maybe listen a little bit more.
Exactly. Yeah.
Don't be out there playing for how much hours
Right.
and, you could get snatched and what may have you, right? Like, all of these things are, of course, important lessons that are
Mhm.
ingrained in some of these stories that we just without the care and the concern of sort of continuing to bring them to life and to shed light on them we sort of get away from the origins of our culture and who we are.
Right. Yeah, I agree. And I think history too is important in that because there are lessons. If you want to think about Sakunya, the lady with the red dress who is, looks sexy and she knows how to entice men and then she ends up turning into a bloodsucker, right? So then what is the lesson there? Is like everything that looks sweet may not always be sweet, you know? You're a married man, maybe you should make sure that you pay attention to your wife than going and seeing a woman who's enticing you to do something, So I just think that that's very interesting. It's an interesting story and the lesson in it. Yeah.
To your point, your earlier point, you made a point about, you putting your twist on it. There's still a way to bring these things into today's context. It's not like, oh, this Duane story from, the 1800s has no relevance. There's still ways of us, and I've watched Duane 1, of course, and then the trailer for Duane 2, and like it didn't feel like this was some old, I guess some people, I'm not necessarily that person, but I
Right.
know some people might not necessarily be interested in, watching something that feels old or whatever, but it
Right.
didn't feel that way at all, right? And so there's certainly relevance to these things and something that, very much to your point of, wanting to create these films, I think is definitely relevant for us today.
Yes, yeah. And then on another note too, with that, I do remember having a conversation recently with an organization that I wouldn't mention that was going to share my film screening, the premiere, and they wanted to see it first. And this is one of the big Trini organizations in the area. And the concern for them was that I want to make sure that our story is authentic. And I'm like, well, you know what? You have to be able to think outside the box. That was a conversation I had with them. So that's also when it comes down to being judgmental, right? So now some people may say, "Oh, I'm not going to do the story," because people might judge it and say, "This is not an authentic story told." We have the freedom to do as we please with our creativity. So as you mentioned, that you can have your own twist to it, and that's important. Having your own twist as an artist, but intertwining or weaving the story within the story, into your story world. So I just think that we have to be able to think outside the box and be less judgmental as well.
And definitely want to congratulate you for, the recent screening of Doing Two at the AFI Silver Theater and Cultural Center. And so, definitely wishing for, more premieres and
Thank you.
the feature film so that we can all definitely check out the long range
Thank you
version
so
of the
much.
film. Our listeners know by now, we're 4 years in, what my favorite question is of all of our, strictly facts discussions here. And so what are sort of some your favorite ways Caribbean folklore, especially when it comes to horror, shows up in popular culture?
Huh. Um, that's a good question, but honestly, I don't see as far as horror folklore contributing to. the popular culture, but I know I've seen like bits and pieces of it. So, for example, American Gods had the Anansi story. I actually really love that one. I cannot remember the gentleman who did the speech, but there was also a film that was based on Elijah Bless, and Lisa Bonet played that part. So that was another one. Well, I love that, they had the Nancy and Tribe. Tribe was a masked band in Trinidad. I loved their costumes. I ended up signing up too late and I could not play mass with them. But,
I did
but
last year.
oh, did you? Oh, nice. Okay. I'll be playing with them next year though.
Yes,
But yeah, so I loved how they recreated this costume theme with the Nancy's. I think things like that, is beautiful. But there's definitely room for more of it because there's so much beauty in the culture itself.
certainly. So Duen 1 and Duen 2 are certainly just the beginning, right? I think not only for your own projects, especially wanting to expand out for further audiences in terms of feature films and things to that nature. But what other Caribbean folkloric characters and themes would you love to see on the big screen?
Other folklores, I would love to see. I would say Elijah Bless. I wish actually I started doing the feature a couple years ago and I have not finished it, but eventually I will get back to it. I would like to see something on Secunia. Um, would love to see something on Papa Boys, and honestly, all of the folklore characters. I would like to see that. I would like to also see a documentary that is. I'm probably giving this away too, but I don't have time to work on this, but I would like to see the relativeness of these folklores. So, for example, a leprechaun there's a similar theme to the Duen. And then there's also, I have a friend she's from Jamaica, but she told me that I don't remember what she mentioned, but there's something similar in Jamaica with the same like little children. I don't know if you know the name of them. It's like childlike spirits. I would love to be able to see a documentary on how all of these cultures, although they might be called different names, but they're all relative in the same. I think that'd be really powerful. Yeah,
Definitely. And I
yeah,
think, to our discussion, right, still very relevant to who we are as a people and, how we evolve and the lessons that are a part of them. And as you said, right, put your twist on it. There's a
exactly.
way that it doesn't have to feel like you're telling some story from the 17th century if that's not what you want to
Yeah,
do.
exactly.
Um, yeah. So
Yeah. Yeah. And my hope too is that with the work that I do create with what I just did with Dwayne and then the feature film that I will produce. I know it's a journey, but I will produce it. That it also encourages other Caribbean filmmakers to do the same, that put a twist on their own on the folklore and put it out there.
definitely.
Yeah.
Alyscia, I am so grateful to have had you on the show to not only, talk to me a little bit about horror and folklore, but also, of course, uplifting Duen and Duen 2, that you've most recently released. I am really excited for the journey. I know it'll be a little while because it's still in sort of premiere season in terms of Duen 2 being shown, publicly and stuff. But I will definitely, again, be sure to link Duen 1 on our Strictly Facts syllabus for our listeners who want to tune in and watch it and really get excited and find out other ways to support you in definitely making this feature film for Duen 2.
Thank you so much. I appreciate you. Thank you for having me.
Yes. And for our listeners, as always, I hope you enjoyed. Until next time, little more. Thanks for tuning in to Strictly Facts. Visit strictlyfactspodcast.com for more information from each episode. Follow us at Strictly Facts Pod on Instagram and Facebook and at Strictly Facts PD on Twitter.